You don't actually evaluate the best vendor, the best candidate, or the best idea in the room. Most of the time, you evaluate whichever one you've simply seen the most. That sounds like an insult to your judgment. It isn't. It's a documented feature of how the human brain forms preferences, and it has a name: the mere exposure effect. Understanding it doesn't make you cynical about your own decisions. It makes you dangerous, in a good way, to bad decisions that are dressed up as objective ones. The research behind this goes back to psychologist Robert Zajonc, whose 1968 paper titled Attitudinal Effects of Mere Exposure became one of the most replicated findings in social psychology. Zajonc ran a series of experiments where he showed people simple stimuli, things like nonsense words, Chinese characters unfamiliar to non-readers, or random polygon shapes repeated a set number of times. Mixed in were other stimuli the person had never seen before. Afterward, he asked a simple question: which of these do you like more? The result held up again and again. People rated the shapes and words they had seen more often as more likable, more trustworthy, and more pleasant, purely as a function of how many times they had been exposed to them. Nothing about the content mattered. These were meaningless shapes and invented words, chosen specifically because they carried no prior associations, no cultural weight, and no inherent reason to be liked or disliked. There was no reason attached to the preference, no argument for why one was better. Repetition alone did the work. What gives the finding its staying power is how many different contexts it was tested in over the following decades. Researchers ran versions with human faces, with photographs, with sounds, with brand-style logos, and the pattern kept reappearing. More prior exposure, more liking, almost regardless of what the stimulus actually was. The effect wasn't a quirk of one lab or one type of image. It behaved like a general property of how perception and preference are wired together, which is part of why psychologists eventually treated it less as a curiosity and more as a basic mechanism worth building decision theory around. What makes this finding strange, and worth taking seriously, is that it didn't require conscious recognition. In several versions of the experiment, participants couldn't reliably say which shapes they had seen before and which were new. Their conscious memory of the exposure was weak or absent, but their preference ratings still tracked exposure frequency almost perfectly. The liking came first, or at least independently, from the explicit memory of having encountered the thing. Zajonc argued controversially at the time that affective reactions, gut-level liking or disliking, can form before and separately from conscious cognitive evaluation. You don't need to remember why something feels familiar for that familiarity to shape how you feel about it. The mechanism, as later research refined it, comes down to something called processing fluency. When your brain encounters something it has seen before, even if it doesn't consciously recall the prior encounters, it processes that stimulus more easily and more quickly than something genuinely novel. That ease of processing itself feels good. Your brain doesn't clearly separate "this is easy to process because I've seen it before" from "this is easy to process because it's good." The two get blurred into a single feeling. I like this. Familiarity gets misread as quality. Fluency gets misread as merit. And the entire process happens beneath the level where you'd normally catch it, which is exactly why it survives contact with intelligent, well-intentioned people who genuinely believe they're being objective. It helps to think of the mind as running two separate systems that don't always talk to each other honestly. One system does slow, effortful, reasoned evaluation, weighing a vendor's price against a competitor's, comparing a candidate's actual answers, checking an idea against the counter-arguments. The other system produces fast, automatic, gut-level reactions, and it runs on cues like fluency, repetition, and familiarity rather than on evidence. Under normal conditions, at work, in the 15 minutes before a decision is due, people lean heavily on the fast system, and then, afterward, construct a reasoned-sounding story to explain a preference that was actually decided by exposure. The story isn't dishonest, it's sincere. That's what makes it so hard to catch. The person defending the familiar choice genuinely believes their own explanation, because the fast system handed the slow system a conclusion and let it invent the reasoning after the fact. This is also why simply telling people "watch out for bias" rarely works in the moment. Bias warnings engage the slow, reasoning system, which is not the system doing the damage. The preference was already formed, quietly, by the fast system, before anyone sat down to reason about it. By the time a decision gets discussed out loud in a meeting, the exposure effect has usually already finished its work, and the discussion is really just people rationalizing a conclusion their gut reached earlier, based on nothing more than who or what had been in front of them most often. At work, this shows up constantly, in decisions that feel analytical but are quietly running on exposure counts instead. Start with vendor selection, since it's one of the cleanest examples. A company evaluating competing vendors will often lean toward whichever sales rep has simply shown up in the most meetings, sent the most check-in emails, and generally stayed visible longest throughout the sales cycle. This happens independent of whether that vendor's actual proposal is stronger on price, features, or fit. The decision makers aren't being lazy or corrupt. They're responding, without realizing it, to the fact that one name and one face has become familiar, comfortable, easy to process, while the competing option still requires fresh cognitive effort to evaluate. The familiar vendor doesn't need to win the argument. They just need to have been in the room enough times that the argument starts to feel like it's already been won. The same dynamic explains something that puzzles a lot of procurement teams. Why incumbent software vendors win renewal contracts even when a newer, objectively better tool is on the table. The incumbent's dashboard, workflows, and account team are already familiar to everyone who has to sign off on the decision. Every employee who touches the tool daily has built years of muscle memory around its menus and quirks, and that muscle memory is itself a form of repeated exposure, reinforced every single workday. Switching costs get cited as the official reason, and sometimes they're real. But underneath the switching cost argument sits a simpler force. The incumbent tool is fluent. People navigate it without thinking. The newer tool, whatever its objective advantages in speed, cost, or capability, requires effort to evaluate and imagine using. That effort gets mentally coded as risk, when it's often just unfamiliarity. Committees will sit through a genuinely superior demo from a challenger, nod along, admit out loud that the interface looks cleaner and the pricing is better, and still renew with the incumbent because comfort with the known tool feels indistinguishable from confidence in the known tool. Hiring shows the same bias in a different costume. A hiring manager reviewing final candidates can feel a distinctly stronger pull toward whichever finalist they happen to interact with the most times throughout the process, even when those interactions were routine scheduling emails, brief check-ins, or small talk before an interview, rather than anything substantive about the candidate's actual qualifications. The candidate who required fewer touch points, maybe because their process moved faster or their coordination was cleaner, ends up feeling slightly less known, slightly less warm, even if their skills and interview answers were stronger. Sometimes it's even simpler than that. One candidate lived closer and could come in for an extra informal chat, or one recruiter happened to schedule 3 calls instead of 1 purely for logistical reasons that had nothing to do with merit. The hiring manager isn't tracking competence at that point. They're tracking exposure and mistaking the resulting comfort for a signal about fit. Internal promotions run on the identical pattern, and this is where it gets costly for organizations, because it operates over months and years instead of a single decision cycle. An employee who sits near leadership, appears in more hallway conversations, grabs coffee near the same kitchen as the decision makers, and simply crosses paths with them more often tends to get remembered more favorably at review time. This happens independent of whether their actual output outpaces a quieter colleague working from a different floor, a different building, or a remote setup entirely. The visible employee isn't necessarily doing better work. They're simply a more processed, more fluent, more familiar presence in the minds of the people who write the performance review. Meanwhile, the remote or physically distant employee has to overcome an exposure deficit before their actual output even gets a fair hearing, and most performance systems have no mechanism for correcting that. But here's the part nobody expects. This bias doesn't stop at individual judgment calls. It also hijacks group decisions that feel collaborative and rigorous. There's a fourth pattern worth naming, because it shows up in a setting most people think of as pure meritocracy, the brainstorm. In a group ideation session, the idea that wins the room is very often not the strongest idea on its merits. It's whichever idea gets repeated the most times during the discussion. Someone floats a concept, another person paraphrases it approvingly, a third person references it again 20 minutes later, and by the end of the meeting that idea feels like the obvious answer, not because anyone stress-tested it against the alternatives, but because it has simply been said out loud more often than any other option. Quieter, less repeated ideas, sometimes objectively stronger, fade from consideration purely because they were only said once. The group mistakes recurring exposure to an idea for accumulating evidence in favor of it. A fifth version of this shows up in ongoing project assignment, and it's subtle enough that most managers never notice they're doing it. A manager keeps assigning new projects to the same familiar team, the one they've worked with before, whose working style and personalities they already know well, instead of a newer team that may have a stronger recent track record on paper. The familiar team feels like a safer bet, not because their delivery data actually supports that conclusion, but because working with them requires less cognitive effort. The manager already knows how to interpret their updates, anticipate their blind spots, and read their communication style. That fluency gets experienced as trust. The newer team, whatever their numbers say, requires the manager to build a new mental model from scratch, and that friction gets misread as risk, rather than simply unfamiliarity. Over time, this quietly concentrates opportunity. The familiar team gets more reps, more visibility, and more chances to build an even longer track record with this particular manager, purely because they were chosen first. The newer team, denied the early opportunities, never gets the chance to become familiar in the first place, so the exposure gap only widens. What looks, from the outside, like a meritocratic pattern of the best team keeps getting picked is often just a self-reinforcing loop that started with a single early exposure advantage and never got questioned. Here's my own read on why this particular bias is more dangerous than most cognitive biases people worry about at work. It doesn't feel like a bias while it's happening. Overconfidence, at least sometimes, announces itself as a gut feeling you can interrogate. Confirmation bias at least involves actively searching for supporting evidence, which leaves a trail. The mere exposure effect produces a feeling that is functionally indistinguishable from the inside, from genuine, earned confidence in quality. You don't experience it as, I've seen this a lot, so I like it. You experience it as, I've thought this through, and this is clearly the better option. The disguise is the entire problem. None of this means familiarity should be treated as worthless or thrown out as a decision input entirely. Familiarity sometimes correlates with real information. A vendor who shows up often may also genuinely communicate well, which is a real, relevant quality. A frequently repeated idea might also be repeated because people keep testing it against objections and it keeps surviving. The mere exposure effect doesn't mean every familiar option is secretly the weaker one. It means you can no longer trust your own gut to distinguish, on its own, between this is familiar because it's actually better and this is familiar because it's just been in front of me more. So here's the practical fix, and it has to be more concrete than be aware of your biases, because vague awareness doesn't survive contact with a real decision. Before you finalize any choice that feels obvious, run one explicit test. Separate the frequency of contact from the evidence of quality. Physically, on paper or in a document, list the actual merits of each option, using only information you could defend to someone who had never met either party. Then, separately, list how many times you interacted with each option and through what channel. If the merits list is thin but the exposure list is long, that's your signal. You are not looking at a quality judgment. You are looking at a familiarity effect wearing a quality judgment's clothes. Take the vendor renewal example concretely. Before signing off on the incumbent again, write down, without reference to your gut feeling, the actual price difference, the actual feature gap, and the actual switching cost in hours or dollars, sourced from your own team's estimate rather than the incumbent's account manager. Separately, note how many meetings, calls, and check-ins you've had with the incumbent rep this year compared to the challenger. If the incumbent wins on the written merits, renew with confidence. If the merits are close or favor the challenger, and the deciding factor in your gut is really just comfort and familiarity, That's the moment to slow down and get a second opinion from someone who has had zero contact with either vendor, precisely because their judgment hasn't been contaminated by exposure the way yours has. The same written separation trick works for hiring panels, for promotion committees, and for brainstorm facilitation. A good brainstorm facilitator, once they know about this effect, will deliberately write every idea on a board the first time it's said and refuse to let repetition substitute for a second look. They'll close the session by asking the group to argue for the 2 least repeated ideas before allowing a vote, specifically to counteract the exposure advantage the loudest, most repeated idea has already accumulated by default. For promotions, the same principle means building the review process so that output gets documented on paper, on a shared tracker, on something everyone can see, well before review season, rather than relying on whoever the reviewer happens to remember most warmly from casual hallway contact. A manager who deliberately schedules equal one-on-one time with a remote employee and an in-office employee, and who forces themselves to write down concrete deliverables for both before forming an opinion, is directly counteracting the exposure gap instead of letting it quietly decide the review for them. For project assignment, the fix is almost mechanical. Before defaulting to the familiar team, pull whatever performance data actually exists, delivery timelines, error rates, client feedback, and put it next to the newer team's data, without reference to how comfortable either team feels to work with. If the numbers are genuinely close, that's actually the moment to deliberately give the newer team a chance, specifically because it breaks a loop that would otherwise run on habit indefinitely. The broader takeaway for anyone managing people, vendors, or decisions is this: exposure is not evidence, no matter how strongly it feels like evidence from the inside. Every time a choice feels obvious to you, and you can't immediately articulate why, in terms someone outside the situation would find convincing, stop and ask the one honest question underneath all of this. Am I favoring this option because it's actually stronger, or simply because I've seen it and heard from it far more often than the alternative? If you can't answer that cleanly, you don't have a decision yet. You have a habit dressed up as a conclusion. Follow for more theories that actually explain your workplace.